The Secretary will call the roll.
Roll call of members. The Honorable Senators Angara, Arroyo, Biason, Cayetano, Defensor Santiago, Ejercito Estrada Jinggoy, Ejercito Estrada Luisa Loy, Enrile, Clavier, Gordon, Lacson, Lapid, Lim, Madrigal, Magsaysay Jr., Smenya III, Pangilinan, Pimentel Jr., Recto, Revilla Jr., Rojas, Villar Jr. The Senate President.
There are 17 senators present. The chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader.
Wishing to take the floor on a matter of personal and collective privilege is Senator Miriam Defensor Santiago. I move that Senator Santiago be recognized.
Senator Santiago is recognized on the privilege hour.
Mr. President, the title of my speech is Anak ng Amari. Yesterday, the notorious Amari case. In 1995, the Public Estates Authority, PEA, entered without public bidding into a joint venture agreement, which I shall refer to as agreement, with Amari, a private corporation, to develop 3 reclaimed islands known as the Freedom Islands, located at the northern portion of the Manila-Cavite Coastal Road in Parañaque City. The Freedom Islands have a total area of 157 plus hectares. The agreement further required the reclamation of an additional 250 hectares of submerged area surrounding these islands. And more, the agreement granted Amari an option to reclaim another 350 hectares. Thus, the total reclamation area became 750 hectares. Under the amended agreement, Amari would pay to PEA the sum of some 1.8 billion pesos and would shoulder all the reclamation costs. Afterwards, the 2 parties would share the total net usable area, with 70% going to Amari and only 30% to PEA. Thus, title would be issued in the name of Amari to 367.5 hectares of reclaimed land. In 1997, after a joint investigation, 2 Senate committees submitted a celebrated report with the conclusion that the reclaimed lands are public lands which PEA could not alienate in favor of Amari. This conclusion was later upheld by the Supreme Court in the 202 case of Chavez versus PEA and Amari. The court ruled, since then and until now, the only way the government can sell to private parties government reclaimed and marshy disposable lands of the public domain is for the legislature to pass a law authorizing such sale. In short, just 2 years ago, the court in that notorious case emphasized that Congress is the final authority with power to approve the sale of reclaimed public lands. But apparently, nobody was home when the Supreme Court issued that decision. For today, we have a similar case where the NHA seeks to transfer ownership of reclaimed land on Manila Bay to a private corporation without public bidding, virtually without funding from the developer but at public cost, and without an enabling law passed by Congress. Sinabi na sa kasong Amari na hindi pwedeng ibenta ang reclaimed land sa isang pribadong korporasyon. Pero eto na naman, nilalabag pilit ang saligang batas. Kaya dapat lamang tawagin ang kaso nitong mapalad na negosyanteng si Regis Romero II na anak ng Amari dahil sa hindi pagbibigay ng pansin sa kapangyarihan ng Kongreso. Congressional power to authorize sale of public land. Most of the powers of Congress are described in the Constitution, Article 6, entitled Legislative Department. But the Constitution also grants to Congress additional powers, such as those described in Article 12, entitled National Economy and Patrimony, particularly as follows. Section 2, all lands of the public domain, waters, and other natural resources are owned by the state. With the exception of agricultural lands, all other natural resources shall not be alienated. Section 3, alienable lands of the public domain shall be limited to agricultural lands. Private corporations or associations may not hold such alienable lands of the public domain except by lease. Taking into account the requirements of conservation, ecology, and development, and subject to the requirements of agrarian reform, the Congress shall determine by law the size of lands of the public domain which may be acquired, developed, held, or leased, and the conditions therefor. It bears emphasis that the Constitution, Section 2, provides that any private corporation is expressly disqualified to acquire public lands. In any event, harmonious with these constitutional provisions, the Public Land Act of 1936, which remains the basic law on disposition of public lands, provides, the land shall not be alienated, encumbered, or otherwise disposed of in a manner offsetting its title, except when authorized by Congress. The principle that certain public lands cannot be sold without congressional consent was first emphasized in the 1960 case of Ignacio versus Director of Lands, where the Supreme Court held that until a formal declaration on the part of the government through the executive department or the legislative, it continues to be part of the public dominion, not available for private expropriation or ownership. This principle was amplified in the landmark 1990 case of Laurel versus Garcia, which prohibited the sale of Roppongi property in Japan owned by the Philippine government. The Supreme Court ruled, it is not for the President to convey valuable real property of the government on his or her own sole will. Any such conveyance must be authorized and approved by a law enacted by Congress. It requires executive and legislative concurrence. Procedure for selling reclaimed land. As a reminder to those officials of the NHA and other similarly inclined government agencies who seem to take the view that reclaimed land can be sold or otherwise alienated whenever the fancy strikes them, or perhaps when the temptation to get rich quick seduces them, allow me to educate those who insist on their own ignorance that the Regalian Doctrine is part of our legal history and culture. The Regalian Doctrine, which, like the law of waters we inherited from the Spanish regime, provides that the state owns all lands and waters of the public domain. This doctrine is now found in the Civil Code, which provides, Article 420, the following things are property of public dominion. 1. Those intended for public use, such as roads, canals, rivers, torrents, ports, and bridges constructed by the state, banks, shores, roadsteads, and others of similar character. 2. Those which belong to the state without being for public use and are intended for some public service or for the development of the national wealth. Applying the Regalian Doctrine, lands reclaimed from foreshore and submerged areas are owned by the state. Under the Constitution, waters form part of the public domain and are consequently inalienable. Reclaimed lands form part of the public domain because they are reclaimed from such waters owned by the state. Reclaimed lands are inalienable public lands which are beyond the commerce of man. To become alienable, submerged areas should first be reclaimed from the sea and then classified as public agricultural lands, because the Constitution provides that public agricultural lands are the only natural resources that the state may alienate. The mere fact that the lands have been reclaimed do not automatically place such lands under the category of alienable land of the public domain. To transform reclaimed land into alienable land involves a long and complex process. To enumerate the various steps of this process involves an extensive collation and integration of various laws. I would list the various steps in the following order. Number 1, under the Constitution, public agricultural lands are the only natural resources that the state may alienate. Hence, under the Administrative Code of 1987, DENR, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, first decides whether the lands reclaimed from the sea can be classified as public agricultural lands. If so, DNR makes the proper recommendation to the President. Number 2, under the Public Land Act, Section 8, the President exercises the authority to classify inalienable lands of the public domain into alienable or disposable lands of the public domain. This is the contemplation of the Civil Code, which provides Article 422, property of public dominion, when no longer intended for public use or for public service, shall form part of the patrimonial property of the state. 3, government declares that these lands are no longer needed for public use, public service, or quasi-public use. 4, under the Public Land Act, Section 63, the PEA asks the DNR for authority to dispose of the land. 5, under the Administrative Code of 1987, the DNR, which exercises supervision and control over alienable and disposable public lands, issues an authority to the PEA to reclaim water areas underwater. 6, the PEA undertakes the physical reclamation of areas underwater, whether directly or through private contractors. 7, under the Public Land Act and the Government Auditing Code, PEA conducts a public bidding in selling or leasing these lands, but it cannot sell the lands to private corporations. 8, if the public auction fails, a negotiated sale is allowed, but the Commission on Audit must approve the selling price. 9, both under the BOT law, Build, Operate, Transfer, and the Local Government Code, the contractor or developer, if a corporate entity, can only be paid with leaseholds on portions of the reclaimed land. 10, under the Administrative Code of 1987, Congress enacts a law which authorizes and approves the conveyance of real property of the government. We can summarize this purposely lengthy process by formulating this principle. Even if all other requirements have been complied with, government cannot sell public land unless Congress passes a law authorizing the sale. Today, the scandalous R2 Builders case. Sometime in March 1999, then President Ramos authorized the National Housing Authority, NHA, to enter into a joint venture agreement, which I will call agreement, with R2 Builders, owned by Regis Romero II, for the conversion of the Smoky Mountain area into a low-cost housing complex and industrial commercial site, officially known as the Smoky Mountain Development and Reclamation Project. In pursuing this project, the Ramos administration, particularly NHA, did not comply with any of the 10 steps I have previously enumerated as essential to the sale of public land, not a single step. The entire Smoky Mountain project turned into a scam even worse than the Amari case, because at least in Amari, the negotiations were conducted by the PEA, which is authorized by law to do so. In the R2 case, negotiations were conducted by NHA, which simply has no such authority. Further, Amari paid PEA the sum of 1.8 billion pesos to buy reclaimed land. In the R2 case, in effect, NHA paid Romero the sum of 3 billion and then gave the reclaimed land to Romero. Where in the world can you find a government that gives a huge amount of money to a developer for the purpose of reclaiming land and then gives the reclaimed land to the developer? Por Dios, por Santo, this contract has made history. It has to be the most lopsided contract in Philippine history, executed in favor of a corporation, which has resulted in huge losses to the government. This is not just graft and corruption spelled out in neon lights. This is sheer, cold-blooded wickedness. The Ramos administration told the public that this project would be implemented, quote, with no cost to the government, unquote. To keep this promise, the agreement provided in Article 2, the developer shall fully finance all aspects of development of Smoky Mountain and reclamation of no more than 40 hectares hectares of Manila Bay area across Radial Road 10. The developer shall reclaim 40 hectares of Manila Bay area directly across Radial Road 10 or R10 as contained in Proclamation number 34 as the enabling component of the project and payment to the developer as its asset share. Article 3, the developer shall fully finance the project and profit sharing with the authority, meaning the NHA, shall be in accordance with the approved pre-feasibility report submitted to the Executive Committee, to wit, for the developer, number 1, to own the 40 hectares of reclaimed land. Number 2, to own the commercial area at the Smoky Mountain area composed of 1.3 hectares. And number 3, to own all the constructed units of medium low-cost housing units beyond the 3,500 unit share of the authority. Under the contract, R2 builders, which I shall call R2, would spend for the entire project and in turn would become the owner, later amended, the owner of 40, later amended to 79 hectares of reclaimed land. And then, what happened to the project? Just like all pies in the sky and tall tales, this one turned out to be a fiasco. R2 built a few low-cost housing units and then declared it had run out of money, thus failing to comply with its contractual obligation to, quote, fully finance, unquote, the project. At that point, it is as plain as daylight to both lawyer and layman that R2 should have been punished. The Office of the President should have instructed the Office of the Solicitor General to sue the developer for breach of contract and damages. Instead, a miracle happened, and R2, instead of being punished, was instead rewarded. The Ramos administration rewarded R2 by using taxpayers' money and financing the project itself at a cost of 3.1 billion pesos. Even more amazingly, the same administration gave the developer the added right to reclaim 150 more hectares of reclaimed land. And, wonder of wonders, the same administration gave 10 hectares of the reclaimed land to Harbor Center Port Terminal Incorporated, here known as Harbor. The fair market value of the 10 hectares is said to be 1.75 billion pesos. Harbor is also owned by Romero. Harbor is a corporation that operates harbor facilities in the project site. The Ramos administration gave it the 10 hectares in exchange for 60% of the voting shares in the corporation. But using anomalous methods, Romero was able to dilute the government share with the result that the majority voting shares now belong to him. In short, Romero not merely reneged on the contract, but is in the process of becoming the owner of public land consisting of 79 hectares of reclaimed land plus 10 hectares of land valued at 1.75 billion pesos, plus the right to reclaim 150 hectares of reclaimed land, plus he effectively owns Harbor Port Terminal. The 3 billion peso question is, has Congress passed any law authorizing the transfer of these public lands to Romero? Answer, no. Therefore, the transfers of these public lands are unconstitutional, illegal, invalid, and criminal. Malversation of reclaimed lands. In view of these allegations, I respectfully move the Senate to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the criminal and civil liabilities of the developer, Regis Romero II, owner of R2 Holdings, Inc., as well as its subsidiary corporations, R2 Builders, Inc., and Harbor Center Port Terminal, Inc., and his cohorts, and to identify the public officials criminally liable under the Anti-Graft and Corrupt Practices Act, Section 2, which provides in paragraph E, it is a crime to cause any undue injury to any party, including the government, or giving any private party any unwarranted benefits, advantage, or preference in the discharge of his official, administrative, or judicial functions through manifest partiality, evident bad faith, or gross inexcusable negligence. Shortly, I shall file a bill defining a special crime to be known as, quote, malversation of reclaimed lands, unquote, when any public officer aids, cooperates with, or otherwise consents to the transfer of reclaimed lands in favor of any private corporation without a law passed by Congress authorizing any such transfer of title. The penalty should be identical with the penalty for plunder, reclusion perpetua to death. In seeking this inquiry, I am well aware of the 1991 case of Bengzon versus Senate Blue Ribbon Committee, where the Supreme Court ruled that after a case had been filed in court, the Senate Blue Ribbon Committee could no longer conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the same subject matter. Last August 5, I learned from a news item that a case was filed in the Supreme Court, Chavez versus NHA, Regis Romero II and his 3 corporations, praying the court to declare that the project and all agreements related to it are null and void for being unconstitutional. However, despite this Chavez case, I respectfully submit that there is nothing to prevent the Senate from conducting an inquiry. The Bengzon and Chavez cases differ in one important aspect. The ratio decidendi, or the basic reason for the decision in the Bengzon case, was the purely private nature of the transaction being questioned. By contrast, here, the transaction sought to be investigated involves public lands and public officials. Accordingly, the ratio decidendi in Bengzon does not apply. And because of this distinctive distinction between the 2 cases, Congress may exercise its constitutional prerogative to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation, not only to determine the legality of the project, but also to identify the persons who have incurred criminal liabilities as a result of the project. Therefore, I move, Mr. President, that the speech should be referred for an inquiry in aid of legislation to the following committees: Public Accountability, Environment and Natural Resources, Public Works, and Government Corporations and Public Enterprises. I believe that the interpellation period for the speech of Senator Biazon follows immediately after this speech, and on Monday, we will begin with the interpellation and the speech of Senator Angara. So unfortunately, for those who may have to raise questions on this speech, my interpellation period will probably take place next week, or maybe even week after next. No, I prefer, unless there are very urgent questions that cannot be delayed, I would prefer for my interpellation period to follow that of Senator Angara, because I fear that it might be an abuse of civility if I were to insist on my own interpellation period preceding his. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, if I may be allowed, I would like to point out that a typographical error, which I read into the records, has to be corrected. This falls under the heading today, the scandalous R2 Builders case. The first sentence reads, sometime in March 1999, then President Ramos authorized, etc. This has to be corrected because Mr. Ramos, who assumed the presidency under highly suspicious circumstances, and the suspicions have grown stronger over the years, this kind of a president was in office during 1992 to 98. So it cannot be possible that this is March 99. I will consult my own original sources and signify to the Secretariat what the proper date is. On another point concerning the rules of our Senate, I have to beg permission to act pursuant to Section 15, which in effect provides that a measure shall be referred to not more than 2 committees, provided that a motion for referral to a 3rd committee shall be referred to the Committee on Rules. The first 2 mentioned committees in my speech are the following: public accountability, environment, and natural resources. Therefore, to comply with the rules of the Senate, I will now move that the matter should be referred to a third committee. Automatically, this motion will have to be referred to the Committee on Rules, the third committee being Public Works. Although I believe government corporations and public enterprises would also have a very strong interest, unfortunately, under Section 15, I am limited to at most only 3 committees, and therefore I make the proper motion to refer this measure to the third committee that I have already mentioned.
All right.
Mr. President.
Senator Enrile.
Mr. President, the historical record of the Senate is to the effect that a similar case was referred to the Blue Ribbon Committee and to the Committee on Government-Owned and Controlled Corporations and Public Enterprises. In fact, the report, if you'll recall, Mr. President, I think you were the chairman of the Blue Ribbon Committee at the time, was prepared by the Committee on Government-Owned and Controlled Corporations and Public Enterprises. And so, with due respect to the suggestion of the distinguished lady senator, may I, with her permission, propose an amendment with respect to the referral that it should be referred likewise to the Blue Ribbon Committee and to the Committee on Government-Owned and Controlled Corporations, PAA being the sole authority under the law to authorize to reclaim lands in this country. Thank you. And it's a government corporation.
That is correct, although I will have to emphasize that under the administrative code, which even I, sitting as a member of the board of directors of the PAEA, overlooked, under the administrative code, it is actually DNR which makes decisions on whether reclaimed land can be sold at all, notwithstanding the charter of the PEA. It has to give its consent. But, Senator Enrile, just to prevent you from reaching your destination, which I know is going to have a negative effect on me, I have no objection. I will therefore move, Mr. President, I will amend my motion to read as follows. I move that this speech should be referred for an inquiry in aid of legislation to the following 2 committees: Public Accountability and Government Corporations and Public Enterprises. And further, I move that referral to the 3rd committee, Environment and Natural Resources, should be referred to the Committee on Rules.
Mr. President, just a matter of remark for the information of the body. I think this is an opportune time for this Senate and Congress itself to revisit this issue in the light of the decision of the Supreme Court in the Chavez versus PEA Amari, where in effect all the reclaimed lands in along the Bay Shore of along the Dewey Boulevard, done by PEA Amari, PEA rather, had been declared not open to disposition by the government. And I'm saying this because there is a law that authorized the sale of reclaimed land, and that is the very charter creating the Public Estate Authority. And I think it's time that the Senate and Congress itself will revisit this in order to address this problem, because this will involve a lot of financial institutions of the government that had, in good faith, lent money to the reclamation of these lands along the Dewey Boulevard.
Mr. President.
Senator Biason is recognized.
with the permission of the lady from Iloilo. Mr. President, even before we may make a final decision on which committees are going to be involved here, may I interject? Mr. President, the PAA had been involved in the disposition of public lands. First, it was the disposition of the stock farms in Muntinlupa. Second, the disposition of the land in the Amari. And the third is the disposition of land, as now referred to basically by the lady from Iloilo. And this is this area surrounding the North Harbor and the Smoky Mountains, Mr. President. In all of those three instances, the major justification for the disposition was housing, Mr. President. As a matter of fact, the disposition of the public lands in Muntinlupa, the stock farms, resulted in the relocation of many squatters, not only in Muntinlupa itself or along the rails, but including the more than 5,000 squatter families that used to surround this building and the building of the Philippine National Bank, where more than 5,000 were relocated to Dasmariñas, not Dasmariñas, but Paliparan, all under the directions of the PEA. Again, the major justification in the disposition of the land, the reclaimed land in the North Harbor to R2 builders, Mr. President, was the justification that, number one, the Smoky Mountains will be developed, and indeed there is now a developed medium-rise building there by 6 floors, where 2,500 families that are now housed in the temporary buildings built by R2 builders inside the port area, the North Harbor port area, Mr. President. Up to now, this temporary housing is still accommodating not only now 2,500 families, because since the inception of this project, yung mga anak nung mga inilipat, doon na rin tumitira ngayon. So ngayon ho, more than 2,500 families na ang nandoon. While the 6-story building, Mr. President, built for a relocation of these 2,500 families are not yet occupied. Although that building had been there for, what, more than 6 years. And I will agree to the implied statement that this contract, Mr. President, was perfected under the administration of former President Ramos. Because the project had been initiated, I think, even during the 9th Congress. Perfected under the 10th Congress. And so therefore, Mr. President, the lady is correct that the contract might have been perfected before 1999. But what the point I'm saying, Mr. President, is maybe the third committee to which this issue may be referred to would be the Urban Planning and Housing Committee, Mr. President. Thank you.
I appreciate the gentleman's concern, but I have a motion on the table, and I will request action on the motion as it was stated.
Majority Leader.
Yes, Mr. President, I have no objections to the referrals. However, considering that the interpellation, period of interpellation, has yet to take place, perhaps we can hold in abeyance the referral to the committees already suggested, manifested, until after the interpellation has been completed.
Perhaps, Mr. President, if I may, I can just therefore move, in the view of the remarks of the Majority Leader, that this speech should be referred to public accountability and to government corporations and public enterprises, and then just leave the question of my motion for a referral to a third committee on the table until after the interpellation or during the interpellation period.
All right. That is in order. All right. So my understanding is that the chair's understanding is that the interpellation can take place on Monday or sometime next week.
That is correct.
Opo. And just for clarity in our journal, I move that this speech should be referred for an inquiry in aid of legislation to the following committees: Public Accountability,